Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, happy March! A while back, I had the privilege of sitting down with Dr. Paul Gagliardi to discuss his book, All Play and No Work, American Work Ideals and the Comic Plays of the Federal Theater Project. Dr. Gagliardi earned his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and his research interests include 20th century American culture, performance studies, labor and economic history, and film and theater. We recorded our interview over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back. With me today is Dr. Paul Gagliardi. He is a teaching associate professor of English at Marquette University, and he recently wrote the book All Play and No Work, American Work Ideals and the Comic Plays of the Federal Theater Project, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Gagliardi.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm very happy to have you. So let's dive right on in. So for those who might not know, what was the Federal Theater Project and how did it get established?
So the Federal Theater Project, which I will say FTP throughout because that's a lot of words, uh, was a arts program, a relief program of the Second New Deal from 1935 to 1939. It was charged with providing work for unemployed theater workers, actors, playwrights, directors, backstage crew, by staging plays throughout the country at free or little cost to attend for patrons. It was a national program. It was divided into a series of, I think, 9 sub-regions, and then each region had its own specific theaters. So the Midwest had like 4 or 5 theaters, for instance. It would stage plays that ranged in all kinds of genres and forms. They would do Shakespeare, they would do Greek theater, they would do children's plays, they would do plays that were tailored for African American audiences, Yiddish audiences on the East Coast, and very politically polemic type plays because it was the 1930s and everything was highly politicized. It was part of what we call the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which was a jobs program of the Second New Deal, led by Harry Hopkins. We'll talk about him quite a lot today. And it was also part of what we call Federal One, which were the arts programs, the Federal Art Project, the Federal Theater Project, Federal Dance Project, Federal Writers Project. How it got started, really all those fields, arts, theater, dance, had really been suffering with the Depression. At some point, we had like 25, 35% unemployment nationally. And in the case of theater, it was really hard hit, right? Because when people don't have money to do anything, they're not going to go to a play. Theater had been in kind of an economic depression throughout the 1920s. In part because it was losing most of its market share to cinema. It was way cheaper to go see, the latest Charlie Chaplin movie than it was to go to a Broadway show. And the head of the WPA, Harry Hopkins, believed very strongly in not only the capacity to give work to all Americans, and this is echoed by Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt as well, but he felt like work shouldn't just be about giving people jobs. Like we should also give work to people that make our lives better and give us like aesthetic value. He believed in it's not just giving people jobs of like digging ditches, but we want to make lives better. And he was a big proponent of the FTP and the similar projects of Federal One.
Yeah, and you discussed pretty early on in the book how the FTP and its fellow Federal One projects kind of faced criticism early on. So what prompted the criticisms and how did administrators respond?
Well, we Americans tend not to like to support the arts. That's always been something relatively controversial throughout the history of the country, even though we love the arts. Like we love cinema, we love reading. And I think it goes back to our kind of Puritan roots, our colonial Puritan roots, that like what we value in terms of labor, in terms of work is something that's tangible, right? And so the idea of giving federal money to supporting musicians and supporting, I forgot the federal music project, supporting musicians and artists and writers and especially theater workers was antithetical to our understanding of what work is and what work relief is. Even though like the budget for Federal One was incredibly minuscule. So it wasn't as if this was a massive boondoggle, right? It was arts projects are funded, but they're very, very small. In the case of the Federal Theater Project, what happened more specifically was there was a lot of resentment from professional theater because now you have, and you can kind of understand it. Like if you're in Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, and all of a sudden you're trying to make money by staging a play, and here comes the federal government staging a free play down the street, you're going to resent that competition. So there is a kind of concerted effort with the FTP of professional theater workers and professional theater owners just saying, this is garbage and these are not good performers. And why would you waste your money or just go to these productions? The bigger controversy throughout their histories of all the Federal One programs, especially the Writers Project and the FTP, was the political content that they were producing. You know, we're not far away from the founding of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which leads eventually to the McCarthy hearings in the 40s and 50s. Right, that's a very simplified historical version, but but people start to see like communist and leftist content in these plays. Sometimes it's a myth, right? People are just like finding stuff a bit too easily. It's not really there. To be fair, there are a lot of plays performed by the FTP that are very leftist. And in some cases, the FTP didn't do themselves a whole lot of favors in what they promoted. But that's something that just doesn't leave the project ever, right? It's immediately it's considered a boondoggle. It's considered a waste of money. But the big thing for most people is this is just like Rooseveltian leftist communist propaganda being forced down our throats.
And somebody that comes into the fore in the book is a woman by the name of Haley Flanagan.
Mhm.
So who was she and what impact did she have on the FTP?
So Flanagan is the director of the FTP. It's funny, like when I was doing my master's or my PhD work, she was like somebody I didn't really like. And then I grew very fond of her the more I studied. So I apologize to the Flanagan family. Um, she is a very fascinating person. She was raised in the Midwest. I think it's South Dakota and Iowa. She went to Grinnell College, and that's where she met Harry Hopkins. They were classmates together. And she started producing, I think she had a theater degree, but she was acting and working on plays at Grinnell College. Eventually, I'm a little fuzzy on her biography exactly, but she gets a job at Vassar and she gets a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's one of the first four women to get a Guggenheim Fellowship, and she travels in Europe in the 1920s, going to France and England and Germany and Russia to see modern European theater. And she talks to like who's who of those traditions. She comes back to the States, and at Vassar, she starts experimenting with these plays called living newspaper plays, which you have like kind of ripped from the headlines stories, and you present like newspaper projections on the back of the screen in the back of the stage. And she writes a lot about European theater. And when the WPA is part of the Second New Deal, and Roosevelt puts Hopkins in charge with Federal One, Hopkins is like the only person I could think of to run the FTP is Hallie Flanagan. And initially she's very like, I don't want to do this, but Hopkins is very persuasive, right? She believed a lot in trying to change what theater was, because the successful theater of the 1920s and 1930s was stuff that was more, I would say mainstream, right? Because that was what's going to put more butts in the seat than anything else. So, you look at the Broadway shows of the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, they tend to be backstage musicals or broad comedies. And she didn't want that. She has a very famous line. She's like, we should do theater that's not just for the first 10 rows, right, of patrons.
Mm.
It should be challenging. It should be uplifting. It should be political. It should make people kind of reflect on who they are, right, as Americans. And that was her big stamp. Now, she got blowback because when you have a lot of theater professionals that you're trying to give money or work to, a lot of them come from, why are we doing a play about starving farmers in the Midwest when we should be doing plays that are trying to make people laugh, right? And give people a show. And so there's a natural hostility that takes place. And she's in a really tough spot too, because she's trying to balance giving people jobs with trying to do different theater or provide different theater experiences. And it just like the job kind of tore her apart, right? I have a lot of empathy for her in that regard, and she's in a really difficult position. It's interesting whenever you see photos of her, like she's very flamboyant in a good way. She always was wearing this red cape, and she's very short, but she just had like this energy about her that I find very compelling and interesting. But yeah, like she's the one that ran everything, and without her, the FTP is going to crumble. I have no doubt of it within the first couple of years. And it's her that keeps it going in
Yeah.
essence.
And you'd mentioned that it was Hopkins who said, Flanagan is the hire. So let's talk a little bit about him and kind of his role in getting all of this off the ground.
Hopkins he comes from also Grinnell College, I'm trying to remember his biography, like a lifelong, very involved in politics, Roosevelt's right hand man in everything, had a nervous energy about him, but was the enforcer,
Mm.
I guess, of the WPA in many ways. Very ardent, right, about defending the program. I write in my book, and not that this is not unique. This story's been told a dozen times, but when they're on the campaign trail, and I think 1936 would have been the election, and they're defending like the Federal One, there's a very famous incident where they go to Iowa State University, right? And there has a big crowd gathered to hear these various people giving stump speeches on behalf of Roosevelt's reelection. And he's talking about Federal One, and someone in the crowd yells, "Who's going to pay for that?" That's a terrible accent. I apologize to everyone in Iowa. It's not even close. And Hopkins says, "You are." Like, we built this university, we build museums, we build all these wonderful things. Why wouldn't we pay for it? We want a better life. We should invest in things like Federal One and the FTP. Eventually, like, his involvement in the WPA is lessened as Roosevelt starts to like shift gears after 1937, the Roosevelt recession. But then the latter half of the decade, Roosevelt tries to get Hopkins to new, fronts, shall we say, coming out of Europe. And once Hopkins kind of leaves the WPA, like that kind of support for Federal One kind of dissipates too. He also wrote a book called Spending to Save, which came out the same year. And I found references that was just ghostwritten by somebody else,
Mm.
and I could not prove it. But allegedly, one of his rivals, I think it was Harold Ickes, was like his arch nemesis in the Roosevelt administration, said it had to be ghostwritten because Harry Hopkins couldn't write to save his life. So I love that. I love that anecdote. I love politicians throwing shade at each other. So.
And so you've talked a little bit or hinted a little bit in some of your previous answers that the FTP was very purposeful in some of the productions it decided to put on.
Mhm.
So how did the FTP work with and against New Deal propaganda?
That's a really great question. On the one hand, the New Deal is, I mean, like we could like debate the term propaganda, but I'm going to use it here because I think it's effective or apropos. There's a lot of elements of the New Deal that support and promote other aspects of the New Deal. The Federal Arts Project, for instance, does a really good job of creating posters and murals throughout the country. There are short films, or they produce posters that promote other New Deal programs. There are sub-agencies of New Deal programs that create propaganda films to promote the Civilian Conservation Corps and all the attempts to agricultural reform in the Midwest or the Southern Midwest and Texas, Oklahoma. And there's a lot of the FTP that is very active in promoting aspects of the New Deal. There's a play called Power, which is performed around the time of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA's debate. And basically, it's arguing for complete public control of all utilities. Like, it's not even subtle. Like, it's it's very straightforward. What's interesting and what I found in my research, but there's also like a lot of, especially the FTP, that's kind of critical of the New Deal. And I should say the New Deal is not like some uniform, consistent, single series of programs. It's a mismatch of a bunch of different things. And there are a lot of plays that are very questioning about aspects of the New Deal in subtle ways and overt ways. There's a play I write about. It's written by Mark Conley and George Kaufman in the 1920s. It's called To the Ladies. And the plot is there's a newlywed couple, Leonard and Elsie, I think are their names. And the husband is kind of very irresponsible with money and trying to get a promotion at his job. And really, it's his wife saving his butt all the time. And there's a moment where he has to give a speech to this banquet with his boss, and Leonard freezes up and someone stole his speech. And so his wife goes up and like gives this amazing speech and basically gets him a promotion. But so much of the New Deal hiring practices, right, across the board tended to support, they tend to privilege male hiring practices. Like there's very much this idea of the male as breadwinner ethos drives a lot of New Deal hiring policies. A lot of work projects given to women are what we would consider very stereotyped, right? Domestic work as opposed to public work. And so a play like that, very subtly, where you have the male breadwinner, like incompetent, not really good at his job, very irresponsible with money, and it's the wife who ends up procuring all his success. And I think in that way, like, I think that play is really kind of undermining all these other aspects of the New Deal that are very pro-male and very misogynist in some ways. And like very clearly to me saying, this is not fair. These are not good programs. This is not equal. We need to like buoy both genders.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue to the next question that I have, because one of the things that is fascinating about your book is that you are exploring this agency through the productions that it put out for the public, and highlighting and researching, very, very different aspects of the agency. And so I'm curious, of all the projects supported by the FTP, how did you decide on which productions to analyze?
That is a great question. I've been asked that a bunch. I don't really have a great answer for it. And really, like, when I started this project, I discovered like no one had really written about most of these plays or really written about comedy of the FTP in general. And so what I did, I remember this very clearly. I got a catalog of all the FTP productions, and I went through the hundreds of them. And just anytime I saw a play produced more than like 4 or 5 times, I would cross-reference it to see if it was a comedy. And that's very banal. That's very boring, right? And I had a list of maybe, I think, 50 different plays. And then I just kind of went through and went to the Library of Congress and found the play scripts and was just reading through them. And what I started to see were these really interesting patterns, right? And some comedies were like, well, clearly this is a farce and there's, I'm not putting much stock into this. But I started to see, okay, I'm seeing a bunch of plays about middle-class life. Okay. I'm seeing a bunch of plays about theater work and theater jobs. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of plays about gambling and speculation. And I'm seeing a bunch of plays about con artists. And I guess for me, it was just like, and then I kind of whittle it down too. Which of those plays is the most interesting and the most complicated? And that's way more fun to write about. Um, but it was much a conundrum to me that why all these plays about work, but also challenging work,
Mhm.
um, or complicating work at a time when you think of the New Deal above everything else, as Roosevelt says over time and time again, the people want work. And my project really is exploring why this, right?
Right.
But yeah, that's really like the 2 minute answer for it. It's very very in the weeds, I suppose.
Well, and again, that's a great kind of segue to the next question that I have for you, which is, you've indicated a little bit in your previous answers. How did the FTP plays promote views of labor and that also critiqued work norms?
Hmm. There are a lot of serious. I'm doing air quotes. Serious plays produced by the FTP that are very obsessed with promoting work as something spiritual and something that like work provides vitality to the individual, and that's very much borrowing from Roosevelt, like Roosevelt's language. For me, what's more interesting is I think how these plays are kind of interrogating traditional work norms, right? And that's a very broad term, right? But I think of like when you think of like things like the Puritan ethic, the Protestant ethic, right? That you put your nose to the grindstone, you save your money, you're diligent, and you reinvest everything that you have, and you gain success, right? And the Puritans, of course, had like a much more spiritual connotation to that. Um, but like when the Depression happens, right? And in some ways, this is not unusual for us, right? People have been kind of browbeaten with this language of this is the norm of work, right? That you should be adhering to. Oftentimes, it's very conservative. It's very like self-reliant, right? This influences our views of relief and charity throughout American history too. And even like something like how middle class work is promoted to people in the 1920s, it's not just simply it's like there's a combination of like your work should be your play. Like you have to derive pleasure from work and work alone. So people in the 30s have been just kind of browbeaten, right, with this idea of the only good work is this kind of work. And and what these plays do is they oftentimes just really challenge that, right? Some of it is just in terms of the characters that you see in these plays. A character might be really successful by just kind of speculating as opposed to working. Okay. You might have a character who is a very successful con artist and they find success through that. So in that way, they're like really pushing against this kind of like very staid and very traditional sense of labor. They also take pot shots at people that are proponents of traditional labor. In the play To the Ladies I just mentioned, the boss is like, "Oh, I don't really support workers who I'm not sure why I'm doing his voice." Um, but he condemns the husband for being irresponsible. And then it turns out his wife also has been the driving force of his success, right? So it's that combination, right? My favorite play is a play called Help Yourself. And I think this is a great example of it. The entire premise is a guy walks into a bank and says, I work here. And he has no banking training. He has no economics training. And what he's able to do is convince people he's been working there the entire time. And he crafts a business proposal out of thin air and it works, right? Um, and he's able to do it in part by being a con man, right? Like just like learning the language of banking rhetoric. He appeals to people's like egos and he's very effective at it. But I think that play in part, right, reminds the audience that like there's not much vacillation between supposedly good business practices and business practices
Mm.
that are a bit more nefarious. And certainly people coming through the Depression or the first part of the Depression, where banks are foreclosing or banks are closing across the country, there are banking scandals. No one likes bankers. And and that kind of works, right? Because like what the play does is it shows that like supposedly like this nature of like structured strong capitalism in America, there's not much difference between like someone who promotes like I work hard every day and they're going around and selling shoddy merchandise and convincing you to buy something you don't need, and engaging in very nefarious, unethical business practices. So in that case, it's very overt, right? It's what we've been told about work isn't really beneficial to us.
Yeah. And I'm curious if through your research you got a sense of how did the FTP kind of choose which projects to support?
um, Yeah. So initially, like the FTP, the guiding ethos, and this is, you'll see this repeated in every story of the FTP, is from Hopkins talking to Flanagan, saying it's going to be free, adult, and uncensored. And initially, like how they selected plays was very decentralized. So theater operators or theater managers in these different regions would suggest plays that would go to regional, and then back to national. It's kind of and I'm very much simplifying this. The problem with that was, as Flanagan noted, sometimes when you have like a decentralized selection of plays, and the thinking was, well, you would pick plays that like really adhere to the market. Oftentimes, like these theater managers would pick plays that just didn't work. All right. In my adopted hometown of Milwaukee, the FTP here, I forget who the manager was, but she was selecting plays that were like Italian opera that didn't resonate with a primarily German German city. Um, so eventually what they start to do is they develop a couple committees and sub-agencies that like both procure plays, but also like check to see if the plays like it fit what they're trying to do with the FTP. But they still take suggestions from regional managers. What's really cool is in the Library of Congress, we still have most of the reports of these readers as they're reading through plays that are suggested, and they offer to, if you decide to stage this play changes, they suggest to make it more updated, or they reject some plays outright because it just doesn't, they're too racist or too problematic.
Hmm.
So there are quite a lot of racist and problematic plays the FTP produced. So it kind of snuck through a little bit. That's really the short answer. Is it's
Yeah.
both like decentralized and eventually more centralized.
Okay. And how does or what does analyzing the FTP productions really kind of tell us about the New Deal overall?
Hmm. I think it reminds us in many ways that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, the New Deal, the New Deal is not uniform, right? The New Deal is like a series of different programs that often contradict one another, right? And it's not like, I guess that's something as a cultural historian, right? I get annoyed by when I hear people say the New Deal is this or it's all this. It's not. It was a mix of these contradictory programs. And it changed depending on where it's being passed at what year. But I think uh, to me, it's a much more alive. The theater, because like the FTP shows how alive the New Deal is in some ways, right? Both how contradictory it is, and how there are debates about what the New Deal should be, right?
Yeah.
I often think, and kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, I think sometimes we presuppose acceptance of a program because it's in the historical past, right? Like
Mm.
we think of the Emancipation Proclamation as something that was okay, yeah, okay, we're freeing the slaves now, except the slaves and states in opposition to the United States government. But it was an incredibly controversial proclamation when it came out. There's I think of this example. There's a play called the Show Off, which is, you know, a 1920s play that gets repurposed for the FTP. I think that's a really good example of showing how open for debate so many ideas of the New Deal were. There's a moment in the play where a recently widowed woman is getting an insurance check from her insurance salesman, right? He brings like the bereavement check. And the characters have this exchange on stage of, what are you going to do with your money? Well, I'm going to put it in the bank to save it for a rainy day. And the characters say something in essence of, gee, I wish more people would take security and take concern with their future more seriously. Otherwise, you're kind of adult. And to me, that's very much like going back to like New Deal propaganda. Like it's not much of a leap to say that's really a reference to the Social Security Act, right?
Yeah.
And other acts that are very concerned with like kind of like a social insurance, right? And again, I think we think of, no one's going to get elected, I don't think, in the United States by saying I'm going to cut Social Security because it's something that we have internalized as a society. Like this is something that's untouchable. That's not the case in 1935, 1936, 1937. And it's like speaking to people, like trying to convince them like what the New Deal is good, right? It's not long before that where people are hearing that any kind of social insurance or any kind of insurance is a bad thing because it only encourages bad behavior or risky behavior. You don't have if you decide to get like car insurance, right? Well, it's going to make you a worse driver because you have that security, right? And I think of moments like that where I think it's good to remember that they're all part of this living, breathing debate over what both work is and what governmentality is. Like, what's our relationship with this new kind of burgeoning larger government, right? That's some ways radically different than what a lot of Americans had experienced prior to this.
Yeah. And, it is a historical analysis, but I am curious, what about our current moment? How do these plays help us ground the present?
This is going to be a long answer. I mean, on the one hand, I think to me, the clear thing is thinking about our relationship with work, right? These plays aren't quite, these performances aren't exactly 90 years old, right? So in like the last 100 years, but in some ways, like we still struggle with our relationship to laboring and work, right? I'm an English professor, right? I recently had my birthday and my youngest stepson, as I'm doing work on my birthday morning, he's like, this is a crime. Why, why are you doing this? And I didn't really have a good answer for him. I'm like, it's my birthday always falls like toward the end of the semester. Like I that's not really a good answer. Um, but and currently I'm a teaching fellow here and like trying to convince people it's okay to not work. Like you don't have to answer emails 24/7. Like you can give yourself a break, right? So I think for all of us, like we are thinking more and more about like what is our relationship to our work. And sometimes it raises like really difficult questions. Like, like you find any number of statistics that like our wages haven't met the rate of inflation since the 1970s, right? Fears about the lack of unionization, right, in places in the United States. Just how much work are we willing to do? I think too, like we also have to think about, and I think this is where the plays really come in. Plays about theatrical labor, about speculation, about middle class life, about swindling and conning. In some ways, like it reminds us that we have to think differently about like the types of work that people engage in, right? All my kids, right? You ask them what they want to do, and I think to a T or to a person, right? They say be a YouTuber, right? And like there's a kind of reaction of, well, that's not a job, right? You can't make a living off doing that or podcasting, right? As the case may be, but you can, right? It's just like a different contract of labor that you're engaging with. But I also think like we need to be concerned about, and this is where kind of a darker answer. is like thinking about things like speculation and gambling and chance, right? That's kind of makes me uncomfortable in some ways. I get an email every month from my 401k, and I open open the website, and it's about like, well, my future security is tied into the fluctuations of the stock market, in essence, right? In the housing market. I I've had a number of conversations this semester with students who have lost immense amounts of money, like
Mm.
doing FanDuel and online gambling, right? And now that's become a kind of like that intersection between working and games of chance is like really starting to vacillate a little bit. And, like we always have to deal with like scams and con artists, right? It's very concerning to me that like there doesn't seem to be any kind of not reprisal or punishment for people that clearly engage in nefarious games of confidence or confidence schemes. On the one hand, as I write about in my book, like sometimes the con artist is a hero, right? Like he's able, or he or she is able to like undermine the capitalist superstructure, just like with the character in Help Yourself. But at the same time, he goes unpunished, right? He's able to succeed. And the same time, just as you're like, that guy's cool, you're like, oh, this reminds me there's the danger of that always happening. So I think very much, and now I'm depressing myself, um, that this book is very much like a direct interrogation or engagement with our current situation.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the book that the plays were a little bit of small scale acts of resistance. So how did they function as resistance?
I like the phrase small scale because I think that's really important because there's an argument that whenever you go to the theater, right, you are forming a community with everyone engaged in that moment, right? And and I think what we see with these plays now, to be fair, like some other FTP productions, like there's a very famous production of It Can't Happen Here. That's national. I think it's October 26, 1937. Like it's staged in like I think 18 different cities across the country. So that's much more large scale. But like I think we have to have limitations of what art can do, right? And I'm not bashing art in that regard, but like I do think like a lot of people went to these plays expecting a night of just entertainment, right?
Mm.
But what we see through like press reviews, what we see through questionnaires that were given to attendees of a lot of FTP productions is people do start to see, oh, there's something I can take away from this, right? That's not to say the plays that I write about are arguing for the overthrow of capitalism, right? But they are leaving with audiences something, right, that's sticking with them. In Help Yourself, a lot of the reviews are like, yeah, bankers, you can't trust them, and the audience leaves with that idea of, okay, I know it's a comedy, I know that yeah, it's going to have a happy ending, but I do see a political point of view here, right?
Mm.
It's very pronounced, I think, in this play called Mississippi Rainbow, which I that is that was a play I struggled with so much, and that I think it took me the most to kind of grapple with. But in short, it's a play about an unemployed black man in Mississippi who decides not to work, who just sits by the riverside and thinks of his big idea.
Mm.
And eventually, what happens is he lays claim to a piece of land that the riverboat company wants, and the riverboat company has to like pay him a whole lot of money. It's written by a white playwright, and, and a lot of the dialogue is, I would say, at best stereotypical, right?
Mm.
At worst, pretty racist. The the development of that play is just a kind of a mess in many regards. But when it's played in Chicago, a lot of the audience sees it as, yeah, we don't like a lot of the things here, but the fact that the main black character is able to outwit a white owner of a riverboat company by doing white labor, white speculative labor.
Mm.
I like that, right? And we have all these audience questionnaires saying like, I feel like we won, right? In
Mm.
this case. And so I think like, yeah, small scale, I think is important. Like they're leaving in a lot of cases, these plays leave something with their audience that resonates with them. And now to be fair, I want to be totally fair, like you can't go to a play and have everyone have the same interpretation,
Yeah.
right? Some people will say in these questionnaires, it was a nice night out, and that's it, right? But we do know that there are enough instances where people are taking something with them. That's a form of, for a night, they feel like we got one, the bankers suck, right? Yeah, we won.
Yeah. And so there is so much that you cover in this book. I loved obviously taking a journey down the New Deal era again as somebody who studied a lot of that in my graduate program. But what would you like readers to take away from your book?
Hmm. I think for me, what would love readers to take away from this is one, as I kind of said before, I want us to like reassess the New Deal and not apply these like strict political readings of it, right? I think it's David Kennedy who says like you can always tell somebody's politics by what they say the New Deal was, right?
Mm.
Um, either it was like Roosevelt, like in a quasi-fascist communist like takeover of capitalism, or Roosevelt didn't go far enough in destroying capitalism. And the truth is, it's way more complicated than that.
Right.
I tend to come on the side of it was trying to restore capitalism, and at times it doesn't really go far enough, and other times like there are successes, right? Um, Things like the FTP are different than a lot of the WPA or other hiring projects in that they give quite a bit of agency to women, to minorities, right? And I think too, like I guess like I want people to think about like how we still have again these same debates,
Yeah.
right? Like there's so many parallels between 1935 to 1939 to our present situation, right? And I guess like just like I'm going to be very idealistic here, right? Like the study of history and culture like can inform so much about who we are and where we're going.
Yeah.
Um, and like this little subset of plays that are kind of a footnote, right, in American political and cultural history, I really can say a lot about that era and our era.
And where should people go when they've finished this book and they want to learn more about the FTP?
There's a lot of resources, and I'm just gonna like there are hundreds, I would say hundreds, like dozens of books on the FTP and the New Deal. Um, some of my favorites are Elizabeth Osborne has a book called Staging the People. My friend Julie Burrell has the Civil Rights Theater in New York. Mackie Barconi has a new book called Harlem's Theaters. I forget the second part of it. Lauren Frost has Dreaming America, a really great book about the children's theater of the
Mhm.
FTP. There are too many to list. I know I'm forgetting a dozen off the top of my head. Two personal shout outs. I am a big fan of the website Living New Deal, right?
Mm.
Which isn't necessarily so much FTP heavy. I think they have a couple of videos on the FTP, but they basically catalog every New Deal funded project across the country. When I've taught the Great Depression in other classes, like the first thing I have students do is like look up your hometown, see what's there, and they'll be like, post office was a New Deal project, or this park, and it's a really great connection for people. Also, the Library of Congress they have I think most of the FTP archival material. I think George Mason University has some. Forgetting one, they have an amazing website on the Federal Theater Project that I can waste hours on, and they've now digitized almost everything they have.
Mm.
So production photos, posters, play scripts, at least the images of play scripts, but just really amazing stuff. All of the photos in my book come directly from the Library of Congress, and just like traipsing through their website. It's really beautiful, right? And you can print out posters, and it's great.
And where should people go to learn about you and your scholarship?
I am still in the process of working on a website I will get there at some point. You can follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram and places like that. I do have a link tree where you can access everything I've written so far, but at some point I will have a more professional website. And yeah, buy my book from Temple University Press.
And we'll make sure to have a link to the book in the show notes for the episode. And is there anything that we haven't covered today that you really want future readers to know?
I think we got the major ideas, right?
Okay.
I would say with my book, I'm still working on the pitch to readers. It's not just about theater. It's about the culture of the era and all the places all the different unique intersections, right? The film, governmental policy. I even have half a section on pro wrestling, and like it all intersects, right? So, yeah, I would say it's not just about theater; it's about a lot more.
Yeah, and perhaps it's my training as a labor historian, but I picked up on the labor conversations and the analysis there. So it's a very well done, nuanced book. There's, I think, something in there for almost everybody. So
Yes.
to all the listeners out there, make sure to grab yourself a copy of All Play and No Work. It is an intriguing analysis of the New Deal era and the Federal Theater Project. So thank you again, Dr. Gagliardi.
Thank you so much. This was a blast.
Oh, good. Thanks again to Dr. Gagliardi for spending his time with me. Be sure to pick up a copy of All Work and No Play wherever fine books are sold. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.